Hi, this is Dave from Two Stroke Performance. Today I'm going to do a quick video on how to rebuild the Powervalve on a KTM 250 and 300 engine. That's one of these things here. It's a fairly common bike. The Powervalve hasn't changed a huge amount in the last 10 years or so this video will be relevant certainly for bikes back to 2006, 2007, and even though some of the components are different, you can use this same video to rebuild even some of the much earlier models as well, because the general principle of the Powervalve is exactly the same. So the cylinder we're using looks like this when it's all stripped down. This one has just been replated, so it's nice and fresh. So let's get into it. So I've got all my parts laid out here. I'm just going to do this in order. I won't talk a huge amount unless I really have to. I always rebuild things like this with a little cap full of oil. So let's get into it. I've got the main flap here that I've already cleaned up. All of these parts that you see down here have already been cleaned. The main flap here has been cleaned as well. There's no need to polish this to a high polish, it doesn't make any difference, but I just go over it with some sandpaper and remove any of the carbon buildup. I've already put the O-rings here and here, so they're ready to go. So start by putting a little bit of oil down. Put a bit of oil also on the ends of the main flap and slide these sleeves over it. Then you can sit the main flap down into position and just gently push on these two sleeves so they sit inwards as much as possible. Next, you need to get your O-rings. These are some of the genuine KTM O-rings for the water jacket here, so sit them down in place. Now normally with as I said, this cylinder has just been replated, so it's not, this surface here is nice and clean, but normally with a rebuild on a bike you would go over, or I would go over this area just with a razor blade and just sort of remove any old silicone, clean up that area. There's no need to sand this down, it's a waste of time. Just go over it with a razor blade and scrape off any old silicone. So now we go to the flange. Now this does need to be cleaned up a bit, so I'll just remove some of the old silicone. Now, however much time you put into this is up to you. As I said before, you don't need to sand these surfaces, they're already perfect from the factory, so my theory is if you sand them you're actually probably going to make them less perfect. So just clean them with a razor blade, get rid of any big chunks of old silicone. Then we'll get some new silicone. I use this Dow Corning product. Just put a little bit on your finger and run just a really thin bead all the way along these surfaces. Need a bit more. You don't need to use too much. I often see rebuild engines where people have used way too much silicone, and to me that just looks really bad, so just use a small amount. Try and use something, I always use a clear silicone on this, it just looks a lot better. You can technically use the red or the orange or the blue silicones, but I think it looks pretty bad. Now we want to place the flange on the cylinder itself. When I'm doing this, I always reach in and lift the main flap up like that, and there's a good reason for that, which I'll tell you in a second. Sit the flange down, press down on it by hand, make sure that everything moves freely. Now install your bolts for the flange. Now the flange has, the flange bolts have got two spring retaining brackets. They go there and there, so always remember that. Put the other two in. Now when I'm doing these bolts up, I always, same thing, reach through and lift the main flap up. If you don't, if the main flap is left hanging down and you do up these 4 bolts, the main flap will bind. So that's something to be careful of. So always hold it up and just one at a time do them up. Just do them all gently at first and then you can go back around and tighten them all. Use your common sense with these bolts. They're only small M6 bolts, so technically the torque setting on them is very low. I just do them by hand. Do them in some stages. You see my hand is still through here, holding that flap up. Sorry about the air compressor. Sorry about the air compressor. So now these 4 bolts are done up. You've got the 2 spring retaining brackets, both pointing across to the side like that. And when I turn the main flap, it's loose, which is good. Always double check that the main flap moves, because as I said, it's quite common to bind it up when you're doing up this front flange. So now we move on to when you're sitting on the bike, move on to the right-hand side of the cylinder. Now I've done this so many times I just know which parts need to be used, but I'll go through them very quickly and hold them up to the camera. So you've got that bit, that little sleeve, that bushing, the spring, that bracket. At this stage you'll have 2 Allen head bolts left. The one that you want for the right side is the one that's slightly longer out of the 2, so this one here. And 2 of these Torx screws. And then you also need, you've got 2 cylinders. The one for the left side has an L stamped into the end of it. I'm not sure if you can see that there, hopefully you can see that. The one for the right side doesn't have anything stamped into the end. So this is the one we want for now. Now this already has an O-ring around it. I've already cleaned all these parts, by the way. So let's get into it. A little bit of oil in there. Always use, you can never use too much 2-stroke oil. I always use a lot of 2-stroke oil when rebuilding an engine. Drop the main cylinder down in there and make sure it turns smoothly. Often, if you're using an aftermarket gasket kit, actually I'll pull this out quickly. If you're using an aftermarket gasket kit and you replace the O-ring here, some gasket kits provide you with an O-ring that's too thick, and so when you put the cylinder in here, it actually doesn't want to rotate smoothly at all. So if that happens to you, then my suggestion is just reuse the existing genuine O-rings, because you're much better off having this thing running smoothly and maybe leaking a tiny bit than binding up. So that's in there. Have the teeth pointing backwards. Take the retaining bracket, drop that in. Next we want our 2 little Torx screws. Let's put a tiny bit of blue Loctite on them. Oops, that's too much. Drop them into place. Just do one side up gently and then go back and do the other side, just so that they seat properly in that plate. Now these things don't need to be done up too tightly, just hand tight like this is plenty. If you do them up too tightly, when you next go to rebuild it, it'll be very hard to get them undone. Make sure that the cylinder rotates. It's certainly firm in there, but it's not binding. It rotates smoothly. Now, so as I said, have the teeth on the cylinder pointing backwards. Reach in. A little trick that I do to align this next piece here, reach in and lift the main flap into the up position, and then look through. I'll try and get it here. Where are we? Look through and rotate the cylinder. You can see the cylinder moving there. Rotate the cylinder so that when you peer through here, the passage is totally open. That side passage is open. So get the cylinder into the open position, and then with the main flap also in the open position, you should just be able to lay this down and it will just mesh properly like that. The next thing to go down is this steel little collar. Then this plate with the socket joint on it. Then the spring with the aluminium collar in it. Now you always put this with the long side of the spring going on top here. So I'll sit that down and I'll show you. Hopefully you can see that. So the long side of the spring is on top of this ball, and the short side of the spring at the moment is pointing upwards. We'll deal with that in a second. Small amount of Loctite on the Allen head bolt. Put it through the whole assembly and just do it up a few turns, maybe 2 or 3 turns. So we'll show you this now. So that's all sitting in there. You can see the short part of the spring is sticking up above everything. Now we grab our pliers, grab the short part of the spring and lift it up and over the pin in the middle. So I've just lifted it up and over the pin, so it's now on the underside of the pin. So when it's all done, you always want the long side of the spring on top and the short side of the spring underneath. Do up this Allen head bolt the rest of the way. Do it fairly firmly, and then double check that it moves. And also look inside here and make sure, hopefully you can see that. Make sure that when the main flap is open, the side passage, this is really hard to look through the camera, the side passage here, if you can see my finger, there we go, the side passage there is also open. So you can look up in this direction as well if you want. So that all looks good to me. So that's that side done. Now we'll go to the left side. Once again, left side taken as though you're sitting on the bike. So the bits we've got left, we've got a cylinder left with an L stamped on the end of it. Got another one of these plates. We've got this assembly here, which already has the stop plate screwed into it. That's the way it came off this cylinder when I disassembled it, and I've just left it there. I've got one more of these Allen head bolts and 2 of these small Torx screws. So I'm just going to do this one quickly. It's pretty much the same as the other side. So I'm making sure that the main flap is open and the cylinder is open. Oops, put this on first. So I've got the retaining plate on. That cylinder moves fine. So I'll just line that up again. Yep. Then with the main flap open and the cylinder open, we should just be able to drop this on and have it mesh on the bottom tooth there, which it's done. A little bit of Loctite on the Allen head bolt. And do this up, but for the moment leave it a bit loose. And the reason for that is I'm going to show you how to set the timing height. So I'll just back that off. So it's done up, but it's a little bit loose. And I'm also going to undo this screw here a bit. So this screw here simply holds the timing plate, or the stop plate. So that plate on top there is the stop plate. Hold that up. That plate there's the stop plate. And this, by setting this plate in a particular position, sets the lowest height of the power valve. So in the manual, it changes a little bit from each make and model, but if you set them, most of them to 48.5 millimetres, well certainly for this particular one I'm working on, which is a 300, it's 48.5 millimetres, it will be bang on. So what we do is take a vernier, set it to, zero at first, set it to 48.5. There are various tools that you can buy to do this. Personally, I just use the vernier. It takes a little bit of fiddling, but what you want to do is set the vernier down into the cylinder so that when you look through the exhaust port here, I can see the bottom of my vernier. I want to have that centered. The power valve main flap has a curve to it, so I want the vernier to be centered so it's sitting at the middle of the curve. And I drop my power valve flap down until it's just level, basically until I can just see the bottom of the vernier. This can take a little bit of doing, because often what happens is when you, so I've got the height right now, often what happens is now when you go to do up these two to lock it in position, it will all move a little bit. So these are both loose. The way that I do it is you do them up in very small little bites. So I'm just doing a very small amount on each one. If you go and do either one of them up fully, the plate will always move. When you've done enough of these cylinders, you can also look, even with the cylinder on the engine, you can look here and you can look at the gap between, the gap down in this little spot. I'll hold that up. So the gap just there where I'm putting the screwdriver, and you can tell, when you've done enough of these cylinders, you can tell roughly whether or not a power valve height is set correctly. That to me is bang on. I tend to set the power valve just a fraction lower than the factory spec from time to time. That to me looks fine, and I'll just double check it with the vernier. And yeah, you probably can't see it on the video, but peering through, in fact you're not going to have any chance, peering through, I can just see the bottom of the vernier in the centre of the power valve flap, just there. So that timing height is correct. So that's it. Now just once again, check to make sure it all moves properly. There is a bit of resistance on these, so that's totally normal. You do have to push just a little bit, but the action should be smooth. It shouldn't be notchy, it shouldn't bind anywhere, and it should go up and down without catching. So that to me looks good. And that's job done. That cylinder's ready to install. Thanks for watching.